Like all of you, I am ready to listen to Professor Matthew Bunn.
So, thank you very much. Thanks very much for that kind introduction. I want to start off with some apologies. First of all, as some of you know, my bag has never arrived, so I apologize for giving an evening talk in running shoes. Secondly, I want to apologize because my slides are only barely living and working with the computer properly, so there may be some glitches here and there. And thirdly, I want to apologize for standing in the way of dinner. So let me try to be relatively brief and to the point. First of all, I'm talking about sort of, in a certain sense, a negative aspect. But it's an important aspect for the future of nuclear energy. Some people think of nuclear security as something that's standing in the way of exploiting nuclear energy. You shouldn't think about it that way. Both safety and security, I think, are key enablers for the future growth of nuclear energy. And nuclear energy is important to India. It's important to many countries for the clean, non-intermittent power that it provides. The public support that we need for that growth of nuclear energy won't be there unless the public is really convinced that these facilities are going to be safe and secure. And if we were to have another huge accident like Fukushima, or worse yet, a terrorist incident that led to a major release of that kind, it would be very difficult to get the support from the public or from investors, for that matter, that would be needed for large-scale growth of nuclear energy. So, yes, every dollar you spend on security is a dollar you didn't spend on generating some electricity or whatever else the mission of your facility is, but it's an important investment in the future of nuclear energy. And I would say that safety and security, as we've already been discussing and as we'll discuss more tomorrow, are inextricably intertwined. If you make it much more physically difficult for the reactor to melt down, for example, that's good for safety, also good for security. It makes it harder to sabotage. But on the other hand, there are things where there are conflicts between safety and security, and so one has to manage this interface. So the next point I wanted to make is that nuclear theft and sabotage are genuine dangers. Terrorists have repeatedly attempted to get the materials and the expertise needed to make at least a crude nuclear explosive. And unfortunately, government studies both in my country and in several other countries have concluded that it is at least plausible that if a sophisticated terrorist group got hold of highly enriched uranium or separated plutonium, that they might be able to make at least a crude, unsafe nuclear weapon. The difference in difficulty between making a safe, high-yield, reliable nuclear weapon that you can put on a missile or a combat aircraft that a state might want to have in its arsenal and making a crude, unsafe device that you can put in the back of a truck is a very big difference in difficulty. So Al-Qaeda had a nuclear program. They had a particular guy in charge of their nuclear weapons effort. By the way, we have no idea where he is or what he's been doing for the last 15 years or so. That progressed as far as actually carrying out some crude but sensible for their level of resources conventional explosives tests in the desert in Afghanistan. Shinrikyo, the Japanese terror cult, also attempted to get nuclear weapons. We don't have evidence of any significant ISIS program, Islamic State program on nuclear weapons. We do have these sort of hints from their extended monitoring of a senior official of one of Belgium's main nuclear research facilities. But if they did turn to a serious program, they've got more money, more people, more territory under control, more ability to recruit experts globally than Al-Qaeda at its best ever had. So I think for the extended period, that is a concern. We know that they are already manufacturing and using their own mustard gas, apparently having recruited experts from Saddam Hussein's old chemical weapons program, which raises the obvious question of whether they've also recruited nuclear experts from that program or others. There are about 20 cases in the public record that are well documented, a couple more in the classified record, of real seizure of stolen highly enriched uranium or plutonium. Most of those were gram quantities. A few were kilogram quantities. But even in the gram quantity cases, the smugglers usually said, oh, this is just a sample, and I have a much larger stock. Now, of course, they have every incentive to say that, even if it's not true. We don't know that it is true, but it's at least plausible that it's true. And there also are multiple cases of efforts to sabotage nuclear facilities. Let me talk about the most recent of those a little bit more. So in August of 2014, an insider in Belgium at their Doel 4 nuclear power plant unit opened a valve that allowed all of the lubricant for the turbine to drain out. And the turbine overheated and destroyed itself. The Belgian investigators still don't know who did it or why. It does not appear to have been a terrorist incident necessarily, since it was not a kind of sabotage that had any chance of leading to any kind of radioactive release or something. It just caused economic damage. But it caused a lot of economic damage. If you count the cost of the replacement turbine and the cost of the replacement electricity while the plant was down, it's well over $100 million. By some estimates, over $200 million in economic damage. So that makes it the largest economic sabotage that's ever occurred in Belgium, and one of the largest ever in the world. So they started investigating, and they found that although probably unrelated because he'd left long before this sabotage occurred, they had an insider who had passed a security clearance to have access to the vital area, who, after that clearance process, had become radicalized, and he left his job at the reactor to go off and fight for the Islamic State in Syria. It's believed he was subsequently killed in Syria. This is a picture of him, a guy by the name of Ilyas Bugalab. Actually, there were two people on staff at the reactor who went off together to fight for the Islamic State in Syria. The other one, I'm not sure whether he had access to the vital area or not. But the fact that he was radicalized fairly rapidly in a period of a few months suggests to me that one of the things we have to think about insider threats is whether current processes where your clearance gets reviewed, in my case, mine gets reviewed every 5 years, it's not obvious that's sufficient. And I think we need to be monitoring people relatively continuously. So, I didn't want to start off without mentioning that India already has some impressive nuclear security practices in place, some of which we don't do in the United States, and probably are things that would make things more secure if we did do them. So your nuclear operators are required to protect against a range of both outsider threats and insider threats. You have a centralized professional security force. You have an interagency process that, as I understand it, reviews threats pretty regularly and adjusts security arrangements based on information about developments. We don't really do that in the United States. We have one design basis threat that's what the facilities have to protect against, and yeah, they get information every once in a while about some things going on, but they are rarely required to really change their security posture in any noticeable way. You have plant-provided worker housing, so that a large fraction of the workers at a plant are living together, and it would be much more noticeable if somebody was becoming radicalized or interacting a lot with some outside group, and you'd have a higher chance of noticing that. And you've participated in a lot of international conventions and initiatives. the Nuclear Security Summits, the IAEA's nuclear security efforts, the Nuclear Security Conventions, and now I was very, very pleased at the Nuclear Security Summit this year that India joined in this Strengthening Nuclear Security Implementation Initiative, which basically calls for implementing at least the general intent of all of the IAEA nuclear security recommendations, which are sort of the foundation of the international efforts in these areas, and having peer reviews on some regular basis. So, as was discussed at the workshop 4 years ago, there are many, many very specific aspects of nuclear security that we could talk about. Lots of different technologies involved, lots of different approaches. I would argue it's something that's never done. It's something like safety that requires continuous improvement. Even more than safety, it requires continuous improvement because in safety, the threats don't evolve very much. You know, the spectrum of earthquakes is going to be the same next year as it was last year, whereas the terrorists adapt and learn and change, and so the defending against the threats that were out there in the last 10 years may not be the right approach for the next 10 years. So it requires continuous improvement. Has many elements, but I think there are 5 broad areas I want to talk about that I think if people really focus on those 5, they'll end up with a pretty good nuclear security program at the end. And of course, all of this, you have to draw a balance. As we were discussing today, you can't have so much security that it prevents you from getting your work done or prevents you from having a safe environment either. So there's a constant balancing that has to be done. You want to be able to defend against, so the first of my 5 is defending against the full spectrum of plausible adversary threats. So you want to be covered against the things that are really plausible, but on the other hand, you don't want to be wasting money defending against imagined armies of 10-foot-tall terrorists that aren't actually out there. Wasting money or creating undue inconvenience. So the IAEA recommendation in this area is that you need to base your system on the current evaluation of the threat, which implies a regular updating of the kind that India, as I understand it, already does. So there are a lot of fairly aggressive tactics that have already been demonstrated by adversaries, either in attacks on nuclear facilities or in non-nuclear incidents. For example, attacks on military bases by terrorists or thieves stealing things from major guarded facilities. So in Sweden, for example, which one often thinks of as a fairly safe country, there was a gang that arrived by helicopter with explosives specially designed for the target they were going after with automatic weapons, landed on a roof of a building, blasted through the sort of glass ceilings on the roof, had purpose-built ladders to climb down, scared all the employees with their automatic weapons, used their explosives to blow through the security door on the vault, stole tens of millions of dollars, flew off in their helicopter, abandoned it, switched to another vehicle. They had spread what are called caltrops, little pointy things, all over the roads around the building to delay the arrival of police vehicles, and they had put a bag that looked very much like a bomb at the police heliport to delay the arrival of police helicopters. So this was like military-style training, and this was a gang that didn't arrive from Sweden. They were mostly Serbian. So even if you think you're a safe country, the threat might arrive from half a continent away. Deception and stealth is another major area of adversary tactics that needs to be protected against. I won't describe the Antwerp Diamond Center heist in detail, but it's amazing. They had so many layers of security at that place that the thieves collecting intelligence over the course of something like 2 years, managed to understand and figure out ways to overcome. Insiders working together are a problem, including working with outsiders or multiple insiders working together. It's very difficult to defend against more than one insider colluding at the same time. And then unusual vehicles like the helicopter that I mentioned. Those are almost routine in prison breaks. Also, other ways of bypassing the security system. In bank robberies, it's not unusual for thieves to tunnel into a bank vault from blocks away. So another of my 5 key areas is strengthening the security culture in the organization, making sure that everybody in the organization really pays attention to security, not just following the rules, although that's sort of the minimum, but being on the lookout for things that might be a vulnerability, things that ought to be questioned and maybe need to be fixed. General Eugene Habiger, who was the commander of U.S. Strategic Forces and then became the security czar at the Department of Energy, said to me, good security is 20% equipment and 80% culture. So how the people are behaving in your organization really makes a difference. And again, there's an IAEA recommendation in this area that all organizations need to give priority to security culture if they're involved in the physical protection of nuclear things. So I think at a minimum we ought to have rules and procedures where every organization that has highly enriched uranium or plutonium or a major nuclear facility that might be sabotaged has some kind of program in place to regularly assess their security culture and try to strengthen it where it looks like there are weaknesses. And some key elements of that, it has to come from the top. If the top managers of a facility aren't really focusing on the security culture of the facility, it's unlikely that the organizational culture will change very much. It's based on a broad understanding of the threat and really understanding that there are threats out there, that the threat is real, and that the security measures are really needed to deal with it. One of the problems that I see in this whole area is that unlike in safety, where we have exchange of operational experience and incidents and lessons learned and so on, that very rarely happens in security. So, for example, years ago, there was an incident in Russia where a businessman from Nizhny Novgorod was offering $750,000 for stolen weapon-grade plutonium for sale to a foreign client. And that, at the time, that was about a century of the average Russian salary, because things weren't going well in Russia at that time. And I have yet to meet a Russian nuclear security manager who's ever heard of that case. And you would think if people are offering that kind of money for plutonium, your security managers should be made aware of that. So I think there's a lot more to do on understanding the threat and then structuring incentives for the staff to pay attention. Because if the reality is that every hour you spend on following the security rules is an hour you didn't spend on something that's more likely to get you promoted, you're going to spend a lot less time on the security. So this is just to make the point that the security culture does matter. I love this picture. This is at a Russian nuclear facility, and the security door provided with U.S. assistance is propped open. And what's great about this picture is it was propped open on the day the Americans were there to take a photo of it being propped open, which makes it clear that they really didn't grasp the concept that it was a problem that it was propped open. I can tell you many security culture stories, but let me tell one on my own country. So in July of 2012, at the Y-12 facility, which is where almost all U.S. highly enriched uranium for our weapons program is stored, an 82-year-old nun and 2 other protesters who were in their 60s passed through 4 layers of fencing, 3 of which were alarmed, and went right up to the edge of the building with the highly enriched uranium. Now, it's a very impressive building. There was never any danger to the highly enriched uranium, I can tell you. If you gave me a small army of guys and a cannon and a lot of explosives, it's not obvious to me. I could figure out how to get into that building. But that may be a lack of creativity on my part, but nonetheless, clearly a huge embarrassment. They were pounding on the walls with hammers. They were there for tens of minutes before they were finally accosted by one guard. And there were many organizational failures involved. It turned out that the site had installed a new intrusion detection system, and they tried to cut corners on the cost of installing it and left a bunch of the old legacy system connected to the new system, and that resulted in about 10 times as many false alarms as they were experiencing before. And they'd just been sort of tolerating that while they tried to figure out how to fix that without spending a lot more money, on the theory that, well, the false alarms can be checked out with the cameras. Well, the cameras had been broken for months, and nobody had bothered to fix them on the theory that, well, we can check it out with the guards. Well, that might work if you weren't getting 10 times as many false alarms, but the guards had long since gotten sick of going and checking out the false alarms. They just assumed every alarm was a false alarm. And so nobody bothered to go check out all of these alarms. And in fact, the people, they were heavily armed people inside the building who heard the pounding and thought, even though it's before dawn and nobody has notified us that there's any construction, I guess we'll assume that there's construction going on out there and we won't bother to go check. So that's the security culture problem. Complacency is the enemy in security in general. When you have a situation where for most guards 100% of the alarms they ever hear will be either false alarms or tests, that most guards will never experience a real incident in their entire career. There's also, I think, a lot of sources of cognitive bias, organizational bias, that lead us to systematically underestimate the probability of small probability but high consequence events in what we're doing. And also the success that we usually have in nuclear security can lead to complacency, which can be a problem. So this is a hypothetical organization that starts off with it's trying to navigate between spending too much on protection, which leads them to go bankrupt, or too little on protection, which leads them to catastrophe. And they start off with an emphasis a little bit on protection. It starts, everything's fine, so they start cutting corners a little bit. They have a little incident, so they go back to protection, everything's fine. They have another incident, they go back to protection. Then they don't have an incident for a long time, and they end up with a big problem. So success in itself can be a problem. All right, beyond security culture, the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is related to security culture, is protecting against insider threats. This is a big challenge. The insiders are trusted by their staff, by the other staff. They know the security system, or they might know the security system. They've been there for years to think about how would I beat that system. They can use their specialized knowledge. Almost all of the cases we know of nuclear theft or sabotage, where we know how it happened, were perpetrated by insiders. So, the IAEA recommends design the systems to cope with insiders. It's not so easy. Oftentimes, people in their minds rely on one piece of a system for insiders. They say, well, we have a clearance process. We have people go through background checks, so we won't have any insiders in my organization. It doesn't work that way. Clearance processes are not perfect. Or they say, we'll have monitoring of the staff, and if anybody is acting strangely, it'll get reported. I just finished editing a book project with Scott Sagan, and what was most striking to me was the scale of red flags in organizations that people will just write off and not report. So the guy who almost certainly committed the anthrax attacks in the United States in 2001, he actually sent an email to his own staff complaining about his increasingly dangerous paranoia and speculating about ending up in the newspaper with a headline about mad scientist in control of deadly germs, and nobody reported that. Nobody reported that. And in fact, his bosses, had anybody reported it, he had signed documents giving them access to his medical records. Nobody had ever bothered to look at his medical records. If they had, they would have yanked his access to anthrax right away. A number of his psychiatrists thought that he was the most dangerous patient that they had ever encountered in their entire careers. So you need a comprehensive program that includes many elements. And one important element that people often don't think of is it's very simple. It's a program for employee disgruntlement. Over and over again, you see in insider cases that it's a disgruntled employee who feels like the organization has treated him badly. If you just have a complaints program where employees can complain, and then at least some of the time when the complaint has some validity to it, management actually does something to fix the problem. It's amazing the degree to which that reduces employee disgruntlement. Not expensive. So this is just an image of a little pamphlet Scott and I did before the book, which we called a worst practices guide, because it was lessons from past disasters in coping with insider threats. That's available on the web, and the book version, which has much more detailed case studies, different case studies by other authors, will be coming out from Cornell University Press early next year, inshallah. Another thing that we've been talking about in the cyber context this afternoon is realistic testing and vulnerability assessment. There are a lot of systems that look great. You know, you go there, there's a really tall fence, there's guys with guns, it looks like everything is nice and secure, but if you really have an intelligent adversary thinking, how am I going to overcome that, you're actually still vulnerable. We've had this experience in the United States many times where we did tests on systems we thought were pretty good, and the adversary in the test found a way to beat the system catastrophically. Because the adversaries think of things that we didn't think of when we were designing the system. So we were hearing in the cyber context about setting up teams, sort of hacker-type internal teams, with an incentive to find vulnerabilities so that we can fix them and address them. So I think those red teams and tabletop exercises are very important, but also doing full scope of what we call in the United States force-on-force exercises, I think is very important, where you actually have a team attempting to break into nuclear facilities and you see how well the facility does at preventing that. That's now recommended in the IAEA nuclear security recommendations. Last on my list is consolidating material. So no matter how good your security is, it ain't perfect, and there's still some remaining risk. So every facility where there's highly enriched uranium or plutonium or a nuclear weapon is another chance that something could go wrong. And so if you can minimize the number of those places to the number you actually need for your civilian and military needs, then you can reduce risk and reduce costs, because you know every facility you have to protect is another facility that costs a lot of money to protect. So minimizing the number of locations where these things exist is an important part of the nuclear security effort. And I really think each state that has these things ought to look at each site, each building where these exist, and say, do I still need those in that building? Does the benefit I get out of it outweigh the costs and the risk? So in the United States, for example, we've drastically reduced the footprint, the number of buildings with highly enriched uranium, plutonium, partly because after 9/11, the security rules we have in the United States are so expensive to meet that managers had a strong incentive to get rid of this material if they possibly could figure out a way to get rid of it. In Russia, we have managed at many facilities to cut the number of buildings at a particular facility by 2/3 or more at some facilities. So there's a set of principles that I would argue all states with this material ought to be pursuing. Protecting, again, against the full spectrum of threats that are really plausible in your particular country. Having well-trained and well-equipped on-site guard forces. Finally, Belgium, after the recent Islamic State incident, has decided to have armed guards at its nuclear facilities. Sweden has decided it's going to in the future. They were some of the last, but there are still countries that have no armed guards at all at their nuclear facilities. The Netherlands, the host of the 2014 Nuclear Security Summit, is one of them. It was amazing to me that thousands of journalists descended and not one of them noticed that and wrote a story about it. Having these comprehensive programs to protect against insider threats, having the targeted programs to strengthen security culture, conducting these in-depth assessments and realistic tests, having accounting systems where you're doing bulk processing of nuclear material that are good enough, A, that you'd notice a theft, even if it was small amounts of material over a protracted period of time, and B, that you'd be able to localize it in place and time and know who had access at those places and time. And then the effective cyber protection that we've been talking about earlier today. One thing that we're only at the very early stages of thinking about in the United States is combined cyber and physical attacks on nuclear facilities. Could you bring a bunch of the physical protection system down with cyber to aid your physical attack? Or could you alter the material accounting records with cyber to cover up your theft? So, the title was Opportunities for Cooperation, and I think there are a lot. The United States has been cooperating on nuclear security with quite a number of other countries, ranging from Russia, which ended up with, at the peak of that cooperation, Americans crawling all over Russian nuclear facilities and so on, to close U.S. friends like Britain and France, to Pakistan, China, etc. And in each case, it's a different approach to cooperation. There is cooperation between the United States and India. So far, I think it's much more limited and small than the opportunities. It's not fully exploiting the opportunities that are available to exchange ideas and strengthen both our programs by the exchange of ideas and experiences. And it doesn't need to require having Americans visiting your nuclear facility. A lot can be done building on the existing program of workshops that have been taking place at the Global Center for Nuclear Energy Partnership. So I think our two countries ought to establish expert groups in key technical areas. You know, experts from India and the United States can discuss which areas are most interesting and establish groups. We did this with Russia. We've done this with China. So several of the things I've already talked about might be areas for technical working groups. Or you could have more in-depth technology-oriented working groups, like a working group on portal monitoring, or a working group on material control and accounting, or a working group on tamper-indicating devices. Unfortunately, a lot of the seals and tamper-indicating devices that we use today are quite vulnerable to being hacked without detection. And figuring out how to make them less vulnerable to that. Never refer to a tamper-proof item. There ain't no such thing, unfortunately. And there's opportunities for joint research and development, I think. Better tools for vulnerability assessment. A lot of the computerized tools that we use in the United States, for example, are quite good for outsider threats, not very good for insider threats. Improved material control and accounting would be another area for R&D. I think there's a lot of opportunity for our regulators to work together more. There is some cooperation between the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Atomic Energy Regulatory Board, mostly in safety, though. There's very little discussion that's happened there on security. I think there's more opportunities there. Radiological sources. Certainly in my country, we're just at the beginnings on security for radiological sources. And from some of what I've read from my Indian colleagues, I gather that there's some issues here as well. prevention and detection of illicit trafficking, actual implementation of this NSERC 869 that India has now joined up to. So practices on getting ready for a peer review, for example, since it calls for peer reviews. And joint development of initiatives to further strengthen nuclear security now that the summit process is over. So I think there's a fairly broad field for potential cooperation, and I apologize for going on so long, and I'll stop there. I have about a zillion more slides, but that's enough for now.